where I've been for just under a year. Prior to that, worked for almost 22 years at the Morris Arboretum in Philadelphia, and through both positions. And so for for much of my career over the last 20 some years, I've been able to do plant collecting in support of building collections, both domestically and internationally. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a little background before that, just to put things in context and hopefully provide a framework for why it's important to do this kind of work, and why it's important to do this kind of collecting and to have these kinds of collections in botanic gardens and arboretum. So we'll get into that first, and then we'll get into some of the more, more visually appealing images and some things from the field, and then wrap it up. So I'm hopefully should be about 45 minutes or so of my talking, and then one can have some time for questions. So should I just launch into it, Olivia?
That would be great. Thank you so much, Tony.
Okay. All right. Bear with me while I share my screen and get this set up. Okay. Okay. Does that look good?
Perfect.
Okay. So as a way of introduction, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about plant exploration and tree conservation, and talk about a few other things as well. And so we'll just sort of launch right into this. So I want to start out by, as I said, providing a framework for why it's important to do plant exploration. And there's some recent work that came out of a collaboration between these three organizations, looking at a worldwide assessment of trees and how threatened those trees are around the world. And so this is a report that came out last September looking at the state of the world's trees. You can find this online through BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International. So essentially, if you look at this quickly, this is kind of a good snapshot. 30% of the world's trees are at risk of extinction. 440 trees have fewer than 50 individuals remaining. 64% of trees are found in at least one protected area. And then there's many experts collaborating to work on these and try and conserve these. So just quickly, if you look at the top biodiverse or tree species rich countries in the world, as you might imagine, most of these are tropical. And in a place like China, there's a large subtropical and near tropical part of China as well. But what's most relevant for us really is looking at plants in China, because much of China has climate that's similar to much of what's in the United States. So in terms of looking at plants that are analogous to us, at least in the sort of northeastern United States, China is probably the best place to focus. So just a couple more statistics. As I said earlier in that previous slide, 30% of all tree species. So that's about, when you look at the actual numbers, 17,500 species. It's a big number threatened with extinction. That's a lot of species when you look at it that way. 30%, you might think, oh, that's not much, but 17,000 is a big number. And then, some of these are really, really threatened, and some are threatened in places that you might not think where trees have threats. And there's a sorbus arvanensis, a white beam. It's found in North Wales with only 30 trees remaining. So, very, very, something that's very much on the precipice of extinction. One of the things that BGCI does is leverage their resources to bring experts together from around the world and come up with consortia that really are dedicated to conserving specific plant groups. And you can see those consortia listed here. I'm going to touch on two of these tonight, maple and oak, but all these others are important. Longwood is not involved so much with these other groups, but really with maples and oaks. You know, I won't read this, but basically the goal of these consortia are really to bring together experts from around the world. You know, primarily the goal is to look at in situ species conservation. That means conserving and preserving the habitats in which these plants grow. That's the top priority. And beyond that, looking at ex situ collections, meaning taking them away and having them in cultivation in botanic gardens or in other places. So that's kind of a priority there. And then looking really to foster connections, foster research around the world among experts in various plant fields. So there's kind of the textbook example of how cultivation can conserve a plant species is Franklinia, the Franklin tree, a North American species. I'm sure many of you are, or hopefully all of you are familiar with this. Found by the Bartrams in the late 1700s, not seen in the wild since then, and literally only preserved, extinct in the wild, and only preserved in botanic gardens. And if it were not for those early explorations, this plant may be completely extinct. So next time you see a Franklin tree, if you don't think of this already, think about what how botanic gardens and private gardens can really help steward and really propel species conservation. And this is sort of the greatest example. So one of the things that BGCI does is come up with red lists. That is, they evaluate all of the species within a genus. And so you can see here, there are red lists for magnolia, for the magnolia family, for maples, and for US oaks. And what these red lists do is categorize all the species within a group into these different levels. And you can see here going from not evaluated or data deficient, least concerned, near threatened, to all the way up to vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and extinct. So this is the hierarchy through which the lens of various species is viewed. And so one example I like to give is something looking at magnolias. And so this is a great time of year because magnolias are really coming into flower. I don't know about you, I haven't looked at your weather, but at least our weather here is calling for 22 degrees on Sunday night. So enjoy the magnolias while you can, because this is going to be their last gasp, I think, I hate to say. So if you look at this, these are pretty familiar magnolias, and it lists a number of ex situ collections, so how many botanic gardens these are held in. And the one that really jumps out to me is Magnolia stellata, the star magnolia, which is very, very commonly planted. It's in, you can see here, it's in many botanic garden collections. It's listed as endangered, so that in its native Japan, it's endangered mostly by habitat loss and fragmentation. And so when you're driving around and you see star magnolias almost everywhere these days, each of those may hold a small genetic component that might help contribute to preserving the species in a bigger sense. So one of the reasons Magnolia stellata is threatened, it grows on the left, you see it growing in the wild. It grows in these swampy, boggy areas, many of which, as I said, are either drained or destroyed for development, or just fragmented in other ways. So this is another great example of how botanic gardens and even home gardens can help preserve the genetic diversity of a threatened species. And no one's really looked at this, but I find it really fascinating that this could be a really good way to look at what's in cultivation compared to what's in the wild, and what kind of genetic diversity is preserved in cultivation. And we will circle back to this idea of looking at the genetic diversity of a threatened species in cultivation versus the wild in a couple of minutes with paper bark maple. So just another couple slides of Magnolia stellata, which is absolutely lovely and something that is incredible at this time of year. So I want to dive a little deeper into oaks and the global conservation consortium for oak. So I said that the red list basically looks at all, in this case, looks at all of the oak species native to the United States and applies the level of threat to them. That chart I showed you with least concern through extinct. And so that's kind of the broad lens of looking at it. And then digging a little deeper, there are things called gap analyses, which look at, for threatened species, how many institutions hold these? What are the XC2 holdings of these? That is, how many plants are held outside of the wild of these various species? So there's this, very nice chart here, and I'll we'll zoom in a little bit on this chart. So if you look at the first bar graph on this chart, and you look at the scale on the left, this is a scale of 4,000, number of plants held in various botanic gardens. And you can see that of these very commonly held species, only two of these are species of conservation concern. That is, they're threatened at some level. Then as the scale decreases, as you get fewer plants, the number of species of conservation concern goes up. So this scale is on 500. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 threatened species on here. This becomes a little more or a lot more obvious when you look at the scale of only 100 species. So as you go to the right on this bar graph, that means as you get fewer and fewer plants held in botanic gardens, you see that the number of threatened species goes up. So in other words, the more threatened the species is, the less common it is to be held in botanic gardens. So there's more threat, essentially, to, if something happens to that plant in the wild, there's less certitude that that plant will be preserved. So these are the species that we really want to focus on, those that have the highest level of threat and basically the lowest amount of backup in botanic gardens. So I'll talk about a couple of examples of what I mean by this. So I'll digress a little bit and then get back to oaks. So back in last fall, my colleague Peter Zale and I traveled to Alabama and Georgia to do some collecting of native azaleas, but also a couple of threatened oak species. Excuse me. So we were only there for a few days. We flew in and out of Birmingham. We made this loop through southern Alabama into Georgia and then back up to Birmingham, making some collections of native azaleas, but also 2 threatened oak species. All these trips involve, many partners. This was, a lot of people kind of converged at once. There were folks here from Auburn University, from the herbarium there. There was a group there from Poly Hill Arboretum on Martha's Vineyard, and then a couple other local botanists as well. So there was an incredible wealth of botanical knowledge on this trip. And you can see the kind of habitat we were in southern Alabama, looking for and collecting Rhododendron austrinum. We then visited a small private property in southwest Georgia in Lee County, near a town called Albany, Georgia. This is a woman named Monica Williams, who lived for decades in a not in a suburban development, a nice suburban development next to kind of a large undeveloped area. This area was logged and was going to become developed, and she and her husband realized then that the development sort of fell through, and she and her husband ended up purchasing this land, and she realized that it was filled with native azaleas and many other special plants. So it's become almost a private nature preserve. It's a pretty remarkable property. And she very graciously hosted Peter and I to do some seed collecting there. So I'll just talk about a couple of things we saw there. One of the things was Rhododendron alabamense, which is has a relatively restricted range, as you can see in this map. Very, very fragrant plant. It's a wonderful garden plant. Very heat resistant, mildew resistant. It's probably beginning to flower down there, at least pretty soon. Wonderful plant. And one of the specimens on Monica's property was this plant she calls the Queen, which is, the biggest and most beautiful rhododendron alabamense that we've ever seen, or pretty much anyone has ever seen. So we were very happy to make some seed collections from this one. Another species there is rhododendron ostrinum. This is a plant that is listed as a vulnerable species. It's imperiled in much of its range. Flowers very, very early in the deep south. Again, these plants are make for really good garden plants. So we made a good collection of that as well. Rhododendron canescens, a much wider range, but still it's always interesting to get an infusion of new material, new germplasm into collections. And so it's another great addition. And then, if I'll go back for a second, if you look at the flower color of ostrinum, this kind of pale peachy yellow, and then the pink of canescens, she has some hybrids there, putative hybrids of canescens and ostrinum. So fertile hybrids too. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes of these. And then finally, rhododendron viscosum, which is an even more widespread species, but a plant that tolerates pretty tough conditions. And again, it's great to have an infusion of new material into collections. So looping back to oaks, one of the things that really kind of shocked both Peter and I was the enormous diversity of oaks in Alabama. And you can see from these graphics that of the total of approximately 90 species of oak in North America, 39 of them occur in Alabama. So, more than 40% of them occur in Alabama, which it seemed like every time we would turn a corner in the woods, we'd see another species of oak that we'd never heard of. So that was pretty enlightening and fascinating while we were there. One of the species that we were very interested in and were able to collect was Quercus boyntonii, which is a critically endangered species. It is has very restricted occurrence in Alabama. You can see from these two maps that occurs in northern Alabama in a few counties, and then from the map on the upper right, you can see there's just a few locations in north central Alabama. So we visited a place just south of Birmingham called Oak Mountain, appropriately, and it has these rocky bluffs, almost bald, with that's a mountain version of longleaf pine. Pine is palustris, but growing up in the mountains, so not coastal at all, which is where it typically grows. And this is an area that normally has a fire ecology, and so one of the reasons that Quercus boyntonii is threatened is because of fire suppression. So even though this seems like a really inhospitable environment, if you suppress fire in here, other things like sweet gum and black cherry start to move in and start to crowd out some of the other species. So Quercus boyntonii may not be what you think of as what we think of typically when we think of oaks. On the left here is the park naturalist Lauren Muncher standing with a Boynton oak, and then on the right slide you can also see one in the background. So these are really small shrubby oaks, but even though they may not get to be particularly big, they can live for upwards of 200 years. So pretty incredible plants. And likewise, the longleaf pines as well at this site can be probably up to 200 years old as well. And the side on the right of that longleaf pine is not a bunch of seedlings. It's actually an old tree that lodged, fell over, but still had enough roots connected that all of the epicormic buds, all the buds along the stem regenerated and sprouted. And so these plants, are very adaptable, very adapted to this harsh environment, and as I said, can live for extremely long amounts of time. So, just getting back to the Boynton oak, on the left is, just kind of a mass of them. These are stoloniferous and shrubby plants, and it's really hard to age something like that. It could be couple hundred years old. And then just a shot of the shoots and acorns of it. So we also made one other oak collection, a species called Quercus georgiana, or Georgia oak. Again, it's threatened, not quite as high a level of threat. You can see from the maps that slightly broader range and more localities. It's really abundant at only a few places. We visited FD Roosevelt State Park on Pine Mountain. This is near the town of Warm Springs, where FDR would go. They called it this. His Southern White House. He would go there to enjoy the baths there and try and just treat his physical ailments there. It's where he died as well. So this is a tall, long mountain bluff that extends above the surrounding, sort of around the surrounding plains. Quercus georgiana is a fairly big tree. It's in the red oak group. Actually makes what we think of more as a sort of shade tree type oak. And here's Peter making some collections there. And I should say that both of these, both the Boynton oak and the Georgia oak, have germinated for us. And so we have a number of seedlings in our greenhouses right now. So those are two oak species that are threatened really on a global level. And then bringing it a little bit closer to home, we're interested in a couple of species that reach the northern limit of their range in Pennsylvania. And so they actually are listed, that is, they're considered threatened in Pennsylvania. One is Spanish red oak, or Quercus falcata. And you can see from this map that the yellow counties in Pennsylvania represent counties with only a few small populations of these. Quercus falcata is a beautiful species, gets great fall color. It seems to be resistant to bacterial leaf scorch, which throughout our area at least is really becoming a scourge for Quercus rubra, for red oak. And so we're looking at this as a potential heat tolerant replacement for red oak. And this is a good example of how plant exploration is not always glamorous. It's sometimes very prosaic. And here we are along a couple county roads in southern Chester County, right on the border of Maryland. And you can see the tree on the right-hand photo is a nice size Spanish red oak, and there's Peter in that other slide. Just give you some idea of scale. So this is a plant, as I said, that we have germinating in the greenhouse. We hope to eventually use as a replacement for some of the red oaks at Longwood Gardens. Similarly, willow oak, Quercus fellows, which once you really get to the Washington metropolitan area and go south, it's very, very common. And you may wonder why we're even interested in this plant. Well, same thing. It's not very common in the wild in Pennsylvania, mostly because its habitat is now, its native habitat is now Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia and Philadelphia Airport. So, but it's also, for us, it's a very heat tolerant plant. But historically, there have been some issues with southern provenances of willow oak not being cold hardy in Philadelphia. So we wanted to get a local provenance of this, and one that would be more suitable and more adapted to Philadelphia. So we made some collections last year along the Delaware River at Andalusia, which is a public garden, semi-public garden, right on the Delaware River. Okay, let me see, I'm just looking at the time, make sure we're doing okay here. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit and looking at maples, which is another one of my great loves. Again, similar story. BGCI came out with a red list of maple a few years ago, an updated list, and essentially those countries, and this is, seems pretty obvious, those countries with the most species diversity has the highest number of threatened species. And maples do get into the subtropics and tropics, where there's very interesting and very diverse number of species, and those tend to be the most threatened maple species. So there's a plant that I collected with some colleagues in China in 2005, a plant called Acer Yui, which is closely related, and something you might know, is trident maple, Acer borgerianum. And Acer Yui is a very close relative to trident maple. It's listed as threatened or endangered, and really threatened by habitat degradation and loss. And you can see that it has a relatively restricted range in central China. So in 2005, we came across a few plants, made a collection there. That area below us, that sort of green and red area, is a parking lot. This is the site of a famous battle in the Chinese Revolution. The Chinese consider this a battle that pretty much turned the tide in the revolution in 1949, 48 and 49. So this is 17 years ago now. And there was a small little hotel being built there. And so we sort of, I've speculated or wondered if that hotel has expanded and whether this small population even exists anymore. So interesting tree that we came across, as I said, closest to trident maple, very, very tough tree, very long-lived species. And we were able to make a small seed collection, and essentially the seed that we collected and grew from this are the only plants of this species that are in cultivation in the West, and maybe even in China. So there's a handful of plants at a handful of gardens in the US, and that is it outside of China, as far as we know. And so this plant is sort of precarious and really speaks to the need for having these collections backed up in botanic gardens. A maple that I think we're all much more familiar with is paperbark maple. And this is an older red list that came out in 2009 or 10. And when I saw this, a light bulb went off in my head, because paperbark maple, which is, relatively commonly grown, is threatened in the wild in China where it's native. And so I began to think about, well, if it's threatened in the wild, what all these plants that are in cultivation, how much genetic diversity is captured in those? And does it really represent the plants in the wild? Or do we need to make more collections of paperbark maple to really ensure that it's going to be preserved? So in other words, how many pandas do you need in captivity to preserve the species? How many paperbark maples do you need in captivity to preserve the species? So this began a long and fascinating journey that's still happening. So paperbark maple, I think we all are familiar with this. It's a plant of many seasons. It has fabulous bark, great summer foliage, great fall color, everything you want in a plant. It's actually a very tough plant. On the West Coast in particular, you see this a lot as a boulevard tree or as a small shade tree. It's used this is the Art Institute in Chicago, used in lots of diverse landscapes. But prior to recently, it had only been introduced into cultivation once in the early 1900s. And so this again raises the question of, how much diversity is represented in cultivation? And that's what we were trying to answer. We were trying to figure out whether the diversity of cultivated plants accurately reflects that of plants in the wild, or whether further conservation efforts are needed. So we'll talk about this for a few minutes, and sort of hopefully show you what we've come up with. So what we did was start to take samples for molecular genetic analysis from plants of known origin in the Eastern United States. We then did the same in the Western United States. We went to the UK to sample trees there. So we tried to capture as much genetic diversity as we could of cultivated plants in Europe and the United States. And then we went to China and sampled plants in the wild and did the genetic analysis comparing the two. So this just shows you where trees we sampled in the Northeast US. There's some really remarkable trees at Highland Park in Rochester. Some of the original plants from a collection that E.H. Wilson made in 1901 ended up there. There's a very fine arboretum there in Highland Park, and these are a couple of those trees. There's a mammoth tree at the Arnold Arboretum that E.H. Wilson collected in 1907. That's also one of the very few wild collected plants. Then went to the West Coast. There's a nursery in Salem, Oregon, Heritage Seedlings, that grows tens of thousands of paperbark maples a year. So what we did was sample basically their seed sources to see, basically as a basis of what they have in cultivation. So here's basically their old seed block where they've collected seed and grown it on, and here's their nursery. And on the left is their new seed block where they get seed from, and on the right are thousands of paperbark maple seedlings that are grown in these big plastic bread box or bread trays. So in all likelihood, if you see or buy a paperbark, it probably came from Heritage Seedlings in Oregon. Then, as I said, went to Europe or to the UK and sampled old trees there, just trying to get a sense of the breadth of diversity there. This is a fabulous trip. Visited all these locations from London going south over into Wales, up into North Yorkshire, and even up into Edinburgh. Visited some really fabulous gardens. This is a garden, a National Trust garden in Wales, a place called Differin, which has a fabulous collection of old trees, and it relatively recently became part of the National Trust, and they're trying to bring the gardens back to life as well. And it's kind of the mecca or holy grail of paperbark maples in the UK, because it seemed that they had some of the original 1901 Wilson plants, but then almost every 10 or 20 years, they planted a whole new crop of them. This was their oldest tree. Sadly, I think this tree has died, but they have offspring from it. So they backed this up, which is the good news. So what we were doing with sampling was we were taking leaves, putting them in these little, these are disposable tea bags, and then putting them in silica gel, the same thing you would buy at Michael's to dry flowers, putting it that to desiccate these. It's kind of flash drying, as it were, and it preserves the DNA, and the DNA can be extracted from these leaves after that. This is one of my favorites. This is at Westonbirt Arboretum. Again, one of the plants that came from Wilson's 1901 expedition. And then the second leg of this was going to China, or one of the other legs was going to China to sample. We traveled within about a 500-mile radius of Xi'an, the capital city of Shanxi. Xi'an is where the terracotta soldiers are, if you know where that is. Just to give you a sense of what 500 miles of radius means in the US. And it was more like traveling around Salt Lake City, because it's very, very mountainous where we were, and just was, travel was challenging. So these are the spots these are trees that were in cultivation prior to our going that we were able to sample. And then these are the locations that we also sampled on top of that. So we got a good sense of the diversity of plants in the wild. And I just want to highlight a couple of the spots that we visited. One was in northern Chongqing province, which is close to where a missionary named Guillaume Farge collected paperbark maple, French missionary, for the first time in the 1890s. So if you see anything, a plant with Fargesii as the specific epithet, it's because of this French missionary collected these early in the 1890s, essentially. So this was the little village that we stayed in there. We were really the center of attention. It's a very remote place without a lot of or probably with no Western visitors ever. And so the kids especially, were very excited to see us and to help us out with our project. So it was a fun place to visit. Traveled outside of that small town to an even smaller village, and we had herbarium specimens and records of where these plants were. So it wasn't like we were driving, just randomly, but still, if you look at a mountainside like this, we knew that there was paperbark maple there somewhere, but it is a needle in a haystack. So our Chinese friend and host Kang Wang in a place like this, he'd go into the village and ask around and ask if anyone knew this tree. And In this case, one of the local farmers, Mr. Shah, did know this tree. The Chinese call it blood maple because of the bark. And he had farmed this hillside or this area his whole life. So he took us up. He was probably in his 60s, and he went flying up this hillside while we struggled to go up this hillside to this population. And you can see how steep it was there. Basically, we had to stand in the bases of these trees to not slide down the hill. And Michael Dosman is standing there with the paper bark. And, they weren't sort of these specimens that we think of. They were just mixed in the forest there. And you can see how precarious it was there. These trees had been coppiced by Mr. Shah and his family for years and resprouted, coppiced for firewood and resprouted. So it's hard to know how old these were. They could be, decades, if not, over 100 years old. So that was one really adventurous place. Then we visited in southern Shanxi province. We left a big city, traveled through the countryside up to a location that we knew about. A tree that had been visited in 1995 by some of our colleagues. Went into this village. On the left is the image of the tree from 95, and then on the right with leaves is my image from, this is in 2000, what year were we there? 15. So 20 years after it had first been seen, we had the exact GPS coordinates, and we were able to go pretty much right to this tree. So this was, this is by far the biggest that any of us have ever seen in cultivation or in the wild. And then the local villagers were happy to see us and host us while we were there. So came back with lots and lots of samples. The Morton Arboretum in one of our partners, the Morton Arboretum in Chicago, did the genetic analysis. And I know you can't read this. Basically what we found is that, the genetically, the plants that the populations that are close to each other genetically are similar, which makes a lot of sense. But the most interesting thing we found is that pretty much everything in cultivation, whether it's in the United States or the UK, comes from the 1901 Wilson collection I keep mentioning. So this is what we call a genetic bottleneck. So that means what's in cultivation, circled in blue here, really does not represent what else is in the wild. So if the species were to go to extinct in the wild, essentially we would only have one small fragment of that. So many of these populations in the wild are on protected land, and we've been doing some work to back up and propagate some of the populations that are not on protected land, and have those trees in China as well as in the United States. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, just want to talk a little bit about some collecting work in Japan. So I was fortunate to go, this is before COVID, in the fall of 18 and 19 to on 2 trips to Japan, including, and on those trips we visited this peninsula in far southern Honshu, Wakayama Prefecture. It's one of the rainiest places in Japan, and stayed at the field station there. It's a forestry research station, and really made some fascinating collections. As with other trips, we had Japanese hosts. On the ends of the slide are from where our Japanese hosts and sort of tour guides from Utsunomiya University, and then colleagues from the Arnold Arboretum and Poly Hill Arboretum on these trips. One of the things we collected was Japanese umbrella pine, Ceratopodus verticillata, kind of a choice collector's plant, but a plant that is either near threatened or vulnerable because of logging and managed forestry. And there are only a few remnant populations left. And we visited one of those. Here we are looking for cones on the Ceratopodus, and this is the location. So this is very narrow ridge, maybe about 2 yards wide, dropping off about 300 feet or more on each side. And you can see these little, they look like pines. These little seedlings are actually umbrella pine seedlings. So here's my friend and colleague, Steve Schneider from the Arnold Arboretum. Happy that we did get some cones. And we collected this in 2018, and the cones looked like this, and we didn't get any germination. And then went back in 2019, and the cones looked like this, and we realized the cones take 2 years to mature. So we do have a few seedlings from this, which is exciting to see these. Also collected while we were in Japan, Stewardia pseudocamellia, the Japanese Stewardia, which this is a little bit easier collecting. Here we are walking through this this forest of basically filled with Japanese Stewardia. And this is a plant that is, pretty widely grown in cultivation, but if you start digging into the records at botanic gardens, there's very little material that's actually wild collected in Japan. So, basically what we're growing is pretty much all the same thing that's been kicked around for decades. And so, again, it was interesting, and we're interested in getting an infusion of new material into the United States. So here we are collecting it. And this was, this was kind of rewarding because we could basically stand there and collect fruits without, falling off the face of a mountain or having to, climb trees or any of that sort of thing. So sometimes it's nice to just have an easy collection. So, okay. In the last few minutes, I want to kind of really shift gears and talk about something else I've been interested in a long time, and timely for this time of year, which is flowering cherries, and looking at how botanic gardens can function, not just for preserving species, wild collected or species of wild origin, but also serve to preserve cultivated varieties and cultivated material. And cherries are a great example of that. So I think at this time of year, we really start to, they start to come into their glory, and it's just a fabulous time of year to think about them. Hopefully they won't get too frosted this weekend. And all, up and down the East Coast and around the world, I think people just become fascinated with flowering cherries at this time of year. So a lot of the introductions of unusual varieties date to the early 1900s and coming out of Japan. This is a catalog actually from 1926 from the Yokohama Nursery Company, and you can see kind of the diversity that they had on sale there. So there's a big infusion of cultivars primarily prior to World War I, but then a little bit after World War I as well. These started to they came into the USDA in Washington, D.C. Then they also came into the Arnold Arboretum as well. But then they began to be popularized by nurserymen, one of whom was a man named A.E. Wohlert, who had a nursery in suburban Philadelphia in Narberth. And he was really into flowering cherries and magnolias and crab apples, and really helped to popularize them. Here's his catalog, which actually looks pretty much exactly like that Yokohama Nursery catalog, with a couple of names that he changed. It's kind of an interesting horticultural history bit there. But Wohlert was selling all these interesting things and gave a big collection to Swarthmore College in the 1930s. So these are some slides of the trees that Wohlert would have given them. This is the 1940s. One of those trees is still hanging on there. But by the 80s, the Scott Arboretum realized that that collection was kind of, slowly dying, and did a major repropagation effort. And many of the trees in the current cherry collection at Scott Arboretum were propagated from those older collections as well. So again, this is something that botanic gardens, arboreta need to do is constantly be renewing their collections and perpetuating them. And one of the trees there, which is a little bit of a mystery, is a plant called Prunus monoga, which is similar to the common Kanzan, but with much perhaps more palatable flower color, much sort of gentler pink flower color. As far as I could tell, This tree at the Scott was the only plant of Minoga in any garden on the East Coast and maybe in the US. So about 10 years ago, myself and the former propagator at the Morris Arboretum started propagating these unusual flowering cherries so that they'd be backed up and that we could distribute to other botanic gardens. So similarly at the Morris Arboretum, this is a planting of a big collection of flowering cherries in 1959. This came from a garden called, a nursery called Kingsville Nurseries, a man named Henry Holman in Kingsville, Maryland, who had an incredible, if you ever come across one of his catalogs, it's amazing to see what he was growing. So essentially in 1959, the Morris ordered one of everything from Henry Holman, and here they are 20 years after that, and they're in the late 70s, and then more than 20 years, maybe, let's see, 1980, this is about 30 some years after that, you know, sort of, again, reaching the end of their natural lives. So, you know, so essentially, you know, these things need to be propagated and perpetuated. And this is something that these two men at the National Arboretum, Roland Jefferson and Don Egoff, did in the late 80s. They realized that a lot of the diversity of flowering cherries around Washington, D.C. were reaching the end of their lives. They did this massive propagation effort and distribution, some of which are still at the Morris. So these plants date to the late 80s. And are, you know, these will be coming into flowers soon. And one of the things that they distributed was a plant called Prunus gyoko, which was originally part of the 1912 planting. These were planted at the White House in 1912. None of those remained there at the White House. And around about 10 years ago, when I really started to get into this, I realized that there was one gyoko at the Morris Arboretum and one at the U.S. National Arboretum. As far as I could tell, none other in the U.S. So it's a really exquisite plant. It has these sort of peppermint striped flowers, which then, or spearmint, not peppermint, spearmint. And then they develop in sort of a spearmint peppermint stripe after that, after a little bit of time. So Shelley and I, Shelley Dillard, the former propagator, and I propagated this and distributed it and backed it up. So now, fortunately, there are more than two in the US as far as we know. So I just want to, what happened here? I'm trying to advance. Sorry. Okay. Let's see, how are we doing here? Similarly, at Longwood Gardens, there's a plant called Prunus higurashi, which is one of my favorite. It's similar, again, similar to Kanzan, but with these really, really tight flowers and these super floriferous flower, you know, clusters of flowers, inflorescences, and a, you know, nice, interesting color. This is another one that we've been propagating and trying to share. And similarly, a Yoshino at the National Arboretum called Awanui, which is almost like an electric Yoshino. Again, they've been propagating and distributing. And then just to wrap up, so we basically tapped out pretty much all of the flowering cherries that we could find in the U.S. And there are, you know, if you look at all the botanic gardens up and down the East Coast, there are, you know, maybe, I don't know, 60 to 75 different, at most, cultivars. And so we tried to back up as many as we could of those. And the next phase was to try and bring in some new material. And I worked with a man named Chris Lane, who's a nurseryman in Kent, in England. He's written a book on witch hazels. He's written a book on wisteria. He's a, you know, avid nurseryman and collector. And working through the U.S. National Arboretum, we've been working on importing flowering cherries into the U.S., which is not a simple task at all. And some of the things that we are working on importing are things that are not in cultivation here, but come from Japan and come from Europe. And just to give you a sample of those, here's just a few. I'll just slide through these, show you a few of these. Matsume Fuki, Pink Ballerina, Pink Shell, Shosar, The Bride. So we have essentially these have to go into quarantine, and there are about 45 cultivars that are not in the U.S. in quarantine currently, and I'm told that at some point these will come out of quarantine, and we'll see. Hopefully, I won't be retired, and hopefully, I'll see these before I retire. So, okay, with that, I will stop sharing and be happy to answer any questions.
So I see that Louise Clark said that she had noticed that there may be a Gyoko at Sam Brown's Nursery in Malvern, Pennsylvania. I don't know if Louise, you want to say anything more about that?
No, I just know that the owner got some of the Prunus Gyoko from the Arboretum's distribution.
Oh, okay.
So that's what I'm coveting myself. So I might get a cutting from him.
Yeah. Excuse me.
Does anyone else have any questions? Jim or Ian, anything to add?
Oh, sorry.
So I have a question. This is Carol. The places where the trees are most endangered are in tropical countries, and they have a very different history and culture than some of the Western European countries and the United States. And so the question is, what is being done to work with the people in those nations within their own cultural context to help cultivate and preserve what may become endangered soon or later, so that it's successful and doesn't rely on a few people going and collecting specimens and bringing them to other Western countries for cultivation.
What was the question?
Yeah, good question. So I think that it's a big question. I'll try and answer it succinctly. I think that, or not, I think, as I said, the primary thing is to try and work locally to preserve plants in situ. That's the primary thing. And the secondary thing is something called near situ. So try and preserve things close to where they're native. And most of the efforts that are going on in in areas of highest threat involve there's a real recognition that it can't be done, it needs to involve, local constituents at various levels. So if you look at, I suggest that you look at the Global Trees Campaign website and look at some of the things they're doing. So there's a real effort on the part of European and Western botanic gardens to collaborate and really work with locals on all levels to engage and to facilitate participation in conservation on a local level.
Thank you. Carol, do you have any follow-up on that one?
Not really. I was just reading about Brazil, for example. So I imagine, Tony, you don't really have any concrete examples you could talk about the type of collaboration and whether or not it's a part of the indigenous culture of a particular nation?
It's a little outside my bailiwick
area. Yeah, I understand.
I would, there's a, it may be online. I mean, I would suggest that you go and look at Global Trees Campaign and BGCI, some of these other organizations, because there are efforts to do that. It's not really my area of expertise. There's an article, if you get Arnoldia, there's an article in the current issue of Arnoldia that talks about just this. So there are examples out there. I just can't pull something up right now. And it's, as I said, it's a little outside of my expertise.
There's another question from Brian, he's asked it in the chat, but he also has his hand raised. Brian, do you want to ask your question verbally?
Hey there. Yeah, I'm just curious. So you've mapped out the locations of all these different occurrences of a certain species. I'm wondering if you have a method for prioritizing with limited resources, either the conservation of those particular areas, the geographic region, or of ways to conserve the local populations because they have some particular traits. Are you able to dig into the genetics to determine whether a local population has something that really makes it really different versus looks different?
Yeah. So again, that's a good question. It's a big question. So and the short answer is it depends, and it depends on the species that you're looking at. And so there's been a lot of work done to estimate how many individuals you need to capture, say, 75% of the genetic diversity of that species. And what people have found is that it depends on, it's very taxa specific, and it's not, and even within a family, it can vary. So you could have two different oaks, and you may need, I don't know, I'm just making these numbers up. You may need 100, samples of 100 oaks of one species to capture, let's say 75% of the diversity, but of another species, you might need, 400. So it varies a lot, and so it varies within a genus, and then across the board with other families. There's been a lot of work done on this. There have been some papers looking at endangered cycads, and they found that once you, for particular species, once you reach a certain threshold of having individuals in collections, for every individual, you basically reach a plateau. So adding individuals does not increase in any lineage, it sort of plateaus the amount of genetic diversity you're capturing. So basically what that tells you is you can say, okay, I get to this point, we have enough individuals to get to some threshold of genetic diversity that we want to capture. And what's kind of inherent, sort of the latest thinking is looking at what are called meta collections. And so it may be impossible for any individual garden to, let's use Quercus boyntonii as an example. I don't know what the threshold is in terms of having individuals to capture that, sort of the broad diversity. Let's just say it's 100, right? Let's just make that number up. But it would be, essentially difficult, if not impossible, for any one garden to grow those 100 individuals. But if you have 10 gardens growing them, you only need to grow 10. And if you have 20 gardens growing them, you only need to grow 5. And so one, you're making it easier for any individual garden to participate in that preservation. And two, you're basically hedging your bets. So if there's some catastrophe, if one garden held all the cards, as it were, of all 100 trees, and there was some catastrophe, that's it. But if they're spread out at 20 different gardens, it's not likely you're going to have 20 catastrophes. So this is what the consortia are really, those consortia that I showed you and talked about. This is one of the prime goals of those consortia is to do just what you're asking, is look at, as an example, look at Quercus pointonii. We need to sample, 10 populations, and we need to get 20 trees from 10 populations, and we need to grow those in 20, I'm making these numbers up, but grow those at 20 gardens. So, and, people have really been working on this and working on, a lot of it has to do with the proclivities of individual gardens, what people are interested in and what they can grow. And this is really the impetus behind these consortia. And the Oak Consortium, at least, the Oak Consortium has a lot of momentum. And one of the things that's happened is because of COVID, we've been able to travel in the US. And so it's actually allowed us to focus our efforts on the US, right? So, because we can't go to China, we can't go, to Japan, we can't go to these other places. So this actually, this sort of been one weird benefit, for lack of a better word, of the last couple of years in terms of exploration. So that's a long-winded answer, but yeah, so I think, so basically these consortia are basically forming the rubric to help answer those questions of how do we prioritize and how do we leverage what an individual garden can do. And, the Oak Consortium is, a very active one, and they have different levels of participation. And you can be even a very small garden with very few resources, and you may only be able to grow 10 trees, but that's a level of participation that they're willing, that they're interested in accepting. And so they have what are called species advocates. So it's actually a person who, and I'm going to be the species advocate for paperbark maple, basically the person who makes sure that diversity is getting spread out among gardens, and kind of, make the person responsible for building those meta collections. So these are, the consortia are still, relatively, I wouldn't say infancy, but they're sort of at their toddlerdom, if that's a word. So they're sort of nascent but moving along. I hope that answers that, Brian.
I had a question. I was wondering, is there any point after these species are kind of established in botanic gardens around the country that nurseries or breeders would step in and they would go into the trade?
It depends, and it gets tricky because some of these things, some of these may not have great ornamental value. So it's hard to think, not to just use this example, but hard to think of something like Quercus pointonii getting into the trade. But the other thing that restricts that is what's called the conventional and biological diversity, which essentially, in many cases, let's say we have permission to go to Japan and collect endangered species. The regulations of that permission might prevent us from distributing that beyond, for more than research purposes. So we might be able to distribute that to other botanic gardens for conservation purposes or research purposes, but not for commercial purposes. So it all depends. I mean, for the rarer things get, the less likely it is to become commercialized. What part of plant exploration is to bring in things for breeding and for commercialization. So it all depends on, it's all very species dependent.
Thank you.
So if I may step in, if you can hear me, Marilyn, I'm under Marilyn's name, but I'm Bob. And so I have a red oak forest, and I am losing 2 to 3 red oaks, 100-foot tall, 24 inches a year in my immediate 3-acre garden, and I have 30 acres outside of that. So you can imagine the number of red oaks that I'm losing in a year.
Sure.
There must be some way that it would be viable for the commercial, for your industry to look at this as a place to say, we can replant this. And I was looking at, I was going to say that some of the other plants would be great to get access to, but it sounds like commercially this is never going to be accessible. But here I'm somebody who's literally losing 50 oaks a year, and when they're gone, they're gone. But there's nothing I can put back in other than weedlings, which are just going to take over, as you can imagine.
Well,
thoughts?
Yeah. So I don't think that's not entirely what I meant. So I think, so one of the, things that I think could be commercialized are, again, things like, native species, in this case, native species that are not widely grown or widely planted. So, Quercus falcata or, Quercus imbricaria or Quercus phellos is pretty widely planted. But so basically what you're describing is what we're essentially looking at, maybe not quite as dramatically, but essentially looking at Longwood is, red oaks do seem to be particularly sensitive to climate change. And so we're looking for alternatives and using natives. And that's why Quercus falcata came up. And that's a plant that it could be, at least from, sort of the mid-Atlantic. It's not widely grown, but that's a case where, nurserymen could drive down the road and collect seeds just like we're doing and commercialize that. So I think there are things that have, great potential to go from being kind of a botanic garden curiosity to being more widely grown. I think that's a perfect example. Similar, maybe willow oak is maybe not as good an example, but the other one is that, I didn't talk about are sugar maples. Sugar maple also, there's it's kind of in the bullseye of climate change. And one of the things that I sort of started to do and hope to do more is to explore. Sugar maple gets all the way out into Oklahoma, a few places in south central Oklahoma, and those even into Arkansas, and those populations have much greater heat tolerance and drought tolerance. So starting to target those things and see how they do in our area, and those are not threatened. Those are things that could jump the fence from kind of botanic garden research into a commercial world. So I think it all depends on what the species are and what the ultimate goals might be for those. But those are two examples I think that have great potential for eventual commercialization.
So just out of curiosity, we're losing chestnut oaks and red oaks specifically. We're seeing some white oak, but not, at least in my property, not so much. Are you seeing the same kinds of things? Chestnut oak, and I know they're same genus, but certainly not same species. So chestnut oak and red oak. Now my chestnut oaks are living, but my red oaks are dying. And so they're all the same, level of forest. But you go 20 miles south of me, and the chestnut oaks are dying. So curious, have you seen that?
Not on the kind of scale that you seem to be describing. I mean, I've seen red oaks having issues, cultivated red oaks primarily having issues, not so much, in forest situations, other than, once they reach, kind of reaching the end of their natural lifespan. But no, I haven't seen kind of the
what would you say is the
situation
end of the natural lifespan?
Sorry?
What would you say is the end of the natural lifespan of a red oak?
I would say, 250 years or so.
Right. Yeah. So my property was logged out by the Conservation Corps in the 20s and 30s. I guess it would be the 30s more. And so most of what I have here is 95 years old. Now they're big, they're 100 foot tall and they're 24 inches in diameter, and they're in the middle of the garden. So you can imagine it's not pleasant to
Sure.
have to get them out of there. It's, there's a lot in the way. So, but I'm obviously it changes the garden completely, because you take a 100-foot tree and it goes away, and suddenly your garden is it's a sun garden instead of a shade garden.
Right.
So
yeah.
And I'm trying to think of things, and I've been really bad because, in fairness, I'm picking things that are not natives to put in because they don't seem to be getting killed. So I'd love to go back to natives, but hard to find.
Yeah, there are certainly these challenges, and that's why it's been so great to have Tony come and talk to us tonight. Jim, do you want to wrap things up? I think we're about at the end.
I'm sorry I came in late. The sun fooled me. Well, the clouds fooled me. I was out in the garden. I thank you very much, and thank God this is recorded so I can hear what you had to say. A few housekeeping things. We've got the AHS sale April 8th and 9th. There will be 2 free vendor parking spots, and 2 of our people at least are vendors, and Elvie has agreed. She's very near AHS to be a stopping point where people can pre-arrange to jump into the car of the people that are members and go and get ferried over there. So the 9th and 10th, we will have some things for sale. Pot up like heck. I will be there on Thursday, where you don't need parking to get in, setting up. Then on Sunday, April the 10th, we'll be going to Gordon Hagen's up at Thurmont to see his magnolia collection. Then we have an orchard tour in Middletown, Maryland. This is where they are growing essentially period to the Civil War apples organically and restoring an orchard in Antietam. I'll pair that with a local nursery. Then, of course, that will be Monday, May the 9th. Remember that Saturday, May the 14th is the Green Spring sale. Again, pot up everything and its grandfather. This is how we're able to do 11 speakers a year. So that's about it. More details as they come in. Are we muted?
Great, well, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and stop the recording and end the meeting. And Tony, we really appreciate your speaking tonight.
Thanks for having me, and enjoy spring.
We do have an address to send the fee to.
It should be in my email signature, Jim. Yep.
Got it.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank you so much.